In a village forgotten by most maps, a place where the clouds moved slowly and the trees seemed to pause between breaths, there lived a man. His name was Albert Finn. He wasn't a mayor. He wasn't a baker. He didn't teach children. Albert counted windows. That's all. And that was enough. He lived in Clumberwick, a sleepy village tucked between hill number 4 and a river too quiet to remember. People didn't rush in Clumberwick. They strolled. They wandered. And sometimes they simply sat. Albert was born on a Monday, a quiet gray morning where nothing much happened. Even the teapot took its time to whistle. His mother sewed curtains. His father watched chimney tops, not because they needed watching, but because he enjoyed it. Albert, from the time he was a little boy, noticed windows. Not just what was behind them, but the frames, the corners, the way the light passed through. At the age of 4, he pointed at a neighbor's window and said, "That one has 12 tiny panes." No one was impressed, and Albert didn't mind. He just smiled and counted another one. By the time he turned 8, he had a notebook labeled "Things That Hold Light." In it, he drew windows, big ones, small ones, windows that tilted open, and windows that hadn't opened in years. Albert's classmates played games. He just walked, fingertips in the air, tracing invisible rectangles. And no one found it strange, because in Clumberwick, nothing was really strange. When Albert grew older, he became an apprentice to Mr. Ebbings, the village's only window duster. Albert learned pane types: hinged, fixed, shuttered, even tall church windows that always looked slightly sleepy. He believed each window had a soul. Some opened to the world, some to the self. He made a logbook. Each page listed date, number of panes, whether a cat had looked through it, and if it creaked. One log said, March 3rd, Miss Tilling's attic, slight smudge, possibly from a sneeze. Very exciting. Albert smiled for 3 days after that. Every morning, he'd sip tea and look across the street. The house opposite had 7 windows. He counted them every day, not because he forgot, but because it brought peace. He noticed small things: a curtain tied slightly higher than yesterday, a flower pot added, a bird resting on the sill. He recorded them all, not in haste, but with joy. The villagers called him Window Boy. He nodded politely. He liked the name. "Why windows?" kids would ask. "Because doors," he'd say, "are too dramatic." He once tried chimneys. Too serious. Too tall. Windows invited dreams. On Sundays, Albert visited the old schoolhouse. It had 23 windows, each one different. One had a crack like a crescent moon. One collected puddles after rain. Albert once watched one puddle dry all afternoon. He kept a feather duster. He dusted slowly, lovingly. He once held a window gathering. Only 3 people came. 1 left early. Still, a success. He served biscuits shaped like panes. He read poetry about glass. They ended the night just watching the library window. Albert's house had 5 windows. He cleaned them weekly. He whispered to them. He believed windows had feelings and liked when people paid attention. There was a window on Hemley Lane, abandoned cottage, paint peeling, shutters broken, but the window perfect. It faced the sunrise. Albert sat near it. He believed it held special light. One morning, the fog on the pane shaped a heart. He didn't believe in signs, but he smiled anyway. He dreamed of windows sometimes, endless panes floating in sky. He drifted between them, each showing a peaceful place. He wrote imaginary panes, not for counting. He wasn't lonely. He had his windows, and they had him. He greeted light, apologized to cracked glass, thanked sills with birds. A bakery opened one day. 3 new windows. Albert bowed and wrote them down. The baker was confused, but offered soft bread. Rainy days were the best. Drops made trails on glass. Albert named them, cheered for the slowest one. He believed the slowest drop always had the best view. And through the years, he kept counting, not because he had to, but because it made time feel gentle. And in Clumberwick, time always moved. Very, very slow. Albert never missed a window festival. Once a year, a nearby town celebrated Glass Day. He traveled there by foot. It took 3 hours. He wore a vest with tiny windows stitched on. Children pointed and laughed softly. Albert waved. He didn't mind. At the festival, he watched artisans shape glass. He whispered thank yous, not to the people, to the glass. Once, a girl gifted him a marble, clear, smooth, round. He stared at it for 10 minutes and finally said, "One pane, no frame. Lovely." She giggled. He kept that marble in a tiny box, labeled it Secret Window. He never published, but he read them aloud to the window in his kitchen. Sometimes he imagined it smiled. Winters were quiet, windows frosted over. He traced shapes on the ice. He called it temporary glass art. Once, he found a frozen bug on the sill. He whispered, "Sorry." Spring brought blossoms and more reflections. Albert loved how the petals stuck to glass, like nature trying to say hello. At night, he lit candles near windows, let the glow warm the panes. He believed it helped them dream. He imagined some windows wanted to see the stars, and others just needed rest. He started a second notebook, labeled Window Moods. Each day, he rated them: sunny, gloomy, pensive, reflective. He shared his findings with no one, except a stray cat. It listened, or seemed to. One morning, he opened his window. A bird flew in, sat for a moment, then flew out. He locked it. April 12th, surprise visitor, chirped once, "Thank you." Albert grew older, hair grayer, steps slower, vision softer, but his love for windows remained clear, always, because in each pane, he didn't just see glass, he saw life, still, quiet, and waiting to be noticed. He made the world one pane at a time. A little more observed, a little more remembered, and that was his gift to glass, to Clumberwick, and to time itself, all through windows. And if you ever pass through Clumberwick and see an old bench near a brick wall, look closely. There may be a man with a notebook, tracing lines in the air, counting, just counting. And if you wave, he may not wave back, not because he's rude, but because he's watching a window dream. As Albert grew older, his days became even quieter. He still woke early, just as the light touched the tops of the houses in Clumberwick. But now he walked more slowly. His steps were soft, as if he didn't want to disturb the morning. The villagers had grown fond of him. He had become part of the background, like the chiming clock at the post office, or the ivy on the bakery wall. Every Tuesday, he visited the library, not to borrow books, though he liked them. He came to sit beside the tall window on the east wall. It was stained glass, old and slightly warped. The colors changed with the time of day. In the morning, it painted the wooden floor with quiet reds and sleepy yellows. In the afternoon, it was mostly gold. Albert never spoke when he sat there. He would rest his hands on his knees and let the sun cover them. Sometimes he closed his eyes. He said it helped him remember. But no one asked what. On the edge of Clumberwick, where the road curves toward the hills, stood an old stone house. It was called the Mirror House, though it had no mirrors. Only windows. So many windows. No one lived there anymore. The owners had moved away when Albert was still young. But the house remained, watching the world through 37 windows. Albert loved it. He went every Sunday with a flask of tea and a biscuit. He would sit on the stone wall outside and count the windows again. He'd done it over 100 times, but still he counted, because the light always changed, and that meant the windows did too. One day, he brought a small notebook titled Reflections That Never Repeat. He filled it slowly, one line each visit. Today, the kitchen window glowed like honey. Today, the attic window blinked at me. Today, nothing changed. It was perfect. Before she left, she asked, "Why do you sit here?" Albert smiled. "Because every pane is a little poem." She didn't understand, but she waved goodbye anyway. Once a year, Clumberwick hosted the Slow Festival. No one rushed, no booths shouted, no fireworks cracked, just music played by an old accordion. And pie, so much pie. Albert always brought his feather duster. He would offer free dusting to any window that looked a little tired. Most people thought it was silly, but they smiled and said yes. Children came to him with drawings of windows. He praised every one. One boy asked, "What's the best kind of window?" Albert leaned close. "The one that lets you dream," he whispered. And then he gave the boy a little sticker shaped like a window frame. That year, Albert entered the pie contest. He didn't win, but his pie was round and soft and sweet. He said it reminded him of a window. No one understood, but they clapped anyway. Silence. Silence. One evening, Albert had a dream. There was no glass, only frames, floating in the sky. Each frame held a memory. One showed his father watching the chimney tops. Another showed the sun through the library window. One frame had no picture, just soft light. He stared into it a long time. And then he woke up. He wrote in his notebook, "Some memories haven't happened yet." That day, he didn't count any windows. He just walked and watched the wind. The village was quiet. Even the birds seemed to wait. He passed the bakery, saw his reflection in the glass. He smiled. He was older, but the windows still knew him, and he still knew them. It happened on a Thursday. The sky was light gray. Albert didn't go for his usual walk. Instead, he sat by his favorite window at home, the one in the kitchen. He sipped tea, wrote a final line in his notebook. "Thank you for letting me see." And then he rested. No one saw him that afternoon, but the next day, the vicar stopped by. He found Albert still sitting, still. A breeze came through the open window, moved the curtain gently. The room was quiet. Albert had gone. Not suddenly, not with noise, just quietly, like closing a shutter at dusk. The villagers placed his notebooks in the library. They kept them in a drawer labeled "Things That Watched With Us." And every year, on the day of the Slow Festival, someone places a feather duster by the old bench, just in case. After Albert passed, his home stood quiet for many weeks. The windows collected dust. The curtains didn't move. The village felt a little slower. Even the birds paused longer on the sills. But one window never closed. The kitchen window. It stayed open through wind, through drizzle, even through early autumn chill. Some said it was broken. Others believed Albert had left it that way on purpose. No one dared to shut it. Children passing by would peek in. They saw a chair, a teacup, and a notebook with soft corners, always in the same place. A cat began visiting, the same one Albert had once fed a biscuit crumb. It curled on the windowsill for hours. People left small things on the sill: a feather, a pebble, a folded drawing of a window. The village agreed. Without a few months after Albert's passing, a girl named Elsie moved into the cottage. She was young, curious, soft-spoken. She didn't close the kitchen window either. When asked why, she only said, "Feels like it wants to stay open." Elsie found the notebooks. She read them all. At first, she didn't understand, but as the days passed, she began to see what Albert had seen. She started dusting windows, She carried a small notepad labeled "Windows That Glimmer." The villagers smiled. They started waving to her like they had to Albert. Some even asked if she would dust their windows too. She did. She never tried to replace Albert, but she kept his habit alive. One morning, she added a new line to his final notebook. "Windows still remember, and I will too." And beneath it, "Thank you, Albert." Something changed in Clumberwick. Not in a loud way, but in small, careful moments. People began noticing their windows more. They cleaned them with more care. They sat beside them more often. The library added a window shelf. Visitors could place small objects there, things seen through windows. The shelf included a pine cone, a tiny drawing of a robin, a silver button, a scrap of blue curtain. No one knew who left them, but everyone understood. It became tradition. When someone moved away, they left a window object behind. When someone was born, a window near their house got new lace curtains. The windows had become storytellers, and the village was listening. 10 years passed, then 20. The kitchen window was still open. Elsie had grown older, but she still dusted. She still watched the light move through the frames. One morning, she found something on the sill. A small gray feather, tied with a string. She didn't know who had left it, but it looked familiar. She smiled and placed it in the notebook. Windows that remember. The entry read, "Perhaps some windows send messages back." She sat by the sill and whispered, "I miss you too." Outside, the leaves turned in slow spirals. The brook beside the town made soft murmurs, and the open window listened. Elsie grew quiet in her final years. She spoke little, but she always smiled at glass. One evening, as twilight poured gold across her wall, she sat in the same chair Albert once had. She looked through the kitchen window, which still had no screen, no lock, just open air and fading sun. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. A gentle breeze touched her cheek like a sigh, and the window creaked once, just once, as if saying goodbye. Elsie's story ended quietly, like Albert's, and again the village remembered. They lit candles in windows that night. All of them. Years passed, and Clumberwick changed, but gently. Shops opened and closed. Gardens bloomed, wilted, and bloomed again. Children grew taller. Trees leaned more eastward. But one thing never changed. The bench by the brook, the one near where the bridge once stood. It had no plaque, no name. It was never repainted. It creaked when you sat. And still, people came. Some came to rest their legs. Others came to eat a quiet sandwich. But many came just to sit and breathe. They didn't know Albert or Elsie, but somehow they always adjusted slightly to the left. The town never told them to. They just did. One winter, a stranger stopped by. She was a traveler. She asked, "Why do people sit here?" A man shrugged and replied, "Because some places feel more than they show." She didn't understand, but she sat. There was a little-known house in the village where no one lived. It wasn't haunted, it wasn't broken, it just whispered. When the wind passed, its chimney made a sound like a sigh. Its windows gently tapped like distant typewriters. No one heard words, but everyone agreed it said something. Teenagers left flowers at its door, not out of fear, but respect. The house didn't scare anyone. It felt tired and kind. The village once voted to tear it down, but no one showed up on demolition day. The workers stood for a while, then left. The house still stands, still whispering, still remembered. Many years after Elsie, a man arrived. No one knew his name, but he wore a teacup upside down on his hat. He wasn't silly. He wasn't loud. He just smiled a lot. He never explained the teacup, and no one asked. He dusted windows, too. He never wrote in notebooks. He just spoke his thoughts aloud. The sky looks sleepy today. This window is listening. That cat knows all our secrets. Some villagers avoided him. Others brought him tea. He stayed 3 years. Then one day, he was gone. But outside the library, where Albert once sat, was a teacup, not upside down, filled with rainwater. A feather floated inside. No note, no name, just left. At the far end of the Clumberwick Library, beyond the history section, there was a shelf called Gentle Writings. There, among books about clouds and tea-making, was one book that always sat open. It wasn't marked. It wasn't fancy. But every week, its page changed. Some said it was the wind. Some said the librarian did it, but the librarian, Mr. Poe, always said, "I've never touched it, and I don't intend it." The pages were always soft thoughts, nothing dramatic, just quiet sentences. Today feels like the color gray. Chairs are important. Some windows are more sky than glass. Children liked to sit and read it. They called it the breathing book. One boy tried to copy the pages, but each time he wrote one down, he forgot what it said the next day. So instead, he just visited and listened. After many years, the slow festival slowly became something more. One summer, a woman named Claire suggested they decorate their windows. Not just clean them, but share them. Each house picked one window. They placed something there: a feather, a candle, a quote, a drawing. Some painted their panes. Some hung soft cloths. No one judged. No one compared. It wasn't about being pretty. It was about being seen. The whole village shimmered with little, quiet stories. Tourists didn't understand, but they stayed longer. Photos were taken, then forgotten. But people who visited remembered. Not what they saw, but how it felt. Warm, safe, like the world had slowed, and a whisper of a thought passed through the town. Maybe this is what bridges do, even the ones long gone. They connect, even without wood or rope, even without remembering. They connect. In Clumberwick, there was a tiny observatory. It had one telescope, a rusty stool, and a ceiling that squeaked. It hadn't been used in years, not since the astronomy club disbanded after forgetting where they stored the key. But one afternoon, a boy named Milo found the key taped to the underside of the bench by the brook. No one knew how it got there, but everyone agreed Milo had a kind face, so he was allowed inside. He looked through the telescope and saw fog, then a leaf, then a moth. He wrote in a notebook, "Sky is mostly waiting." That night, he came back with a blanket and thermos. He stayed 5 hours. He saw 2 stars, 1 bat, and a cloud shaped like a spoon. When asked what he had discovered, he replied, "The sky is very good at listening." And then he added, "Sometimes I think the sky is just a big upside-down window." Mrs. Penelope Cartwright was not a librarian. She was not a historian. She didn't keep bees or make jam. She counted silences. Every morning, she sat at her window, with a small silver stopwatch. She would close her eyes and start counting the moments where nothing moved. Not even wind. She called them quiet stitches, and she believed they held the world together. Too much noise, she once said, and the world might unravel. The children called her Miss Mute, but kindly. When she passed, her journal was placed on the gentle writings shelf. The title read, 10,392 Silences and One More for Luck. The village read one page aloud each year during the slow festival. It was the quietest part of the whole celebration, and also the most loved. Long after the original bridge was forgotten, a rumor began that on certain foggy mornings you could see its reflection in the brook. Not the bridge, only the reflection. People brought cameras. They captured mist and still water. But sometimes, just sometimes, an outline, a ripple. A boy once dipped his hand in the brook where the reflection lay. He felt something, not wood, not stone, but a kind of warmth. He didn't tell anyone, except his grandmother, who said, "That sounds about right." Then she made tea and served it without sugar, as he liked. He never saw the reflection again, but he always sat by the water when he needed to think. One winter, the entire village of Clumberwick overslept. There was no alarm, no emergency, just a nap. Shops opened late. Children arrived at school 2 hours behind. The bakery never lit its ovens. Instead, people yawned. They stretched, and they looked at the sky as if it owed them something soft. No one was upset. Even the town's grumpiest man, Mr. Bletch, simply said, "Well, perhaps time needed a moment." That night, the stars felt closer, and someone left a note on the bench by the brook. Today we remembered how to pause. It was signed with a drawing all window. No name. By now, Clumberwick was known, not for fame, not for tourists, but for waiting. It waited for fog to lift, for bread to rise, for thoughts to settle, and for windows to open. People who visited often returned, not because they needed to, but because something in them hadn't finished breathing there. The bench was still there, the brook still hummed, and the open window in Albert's old cottage still welcomed the breeze. No one said much, but everyone felt much, because Clumberwick was the kind of place that didn't rush. It didn't shout. It didn't forget. It waited, and in the waiting, it remembered. On a windy morning in early spring, a girl named Mina walked along the brook. She wasn't from Clumberwick. She didn't know its stories. She simply followed a feeling. She sat on the bench, and beside her, without realizing, she placed a feather. Not new, soft, a little bent. Later that day, an older man passing by paused. He looked at the feather and smiled. "I've seen this before," he said. He hadn't, but the village had taught him something. Sometimes it's not about memory. It's about meaning. And so the feather stayed, and the wind carried a whisper. Still here, in the cottage where Albert once lived, a child discovered a drawer that stuck. Inside was a small book with no title, only a soft leaf pressed between the pages. The first line read, "Not everything ends. Some things just become quiet." There were no other entries, just blank pages. But every so often, someone would write one more line. Never signed, never loud. I saw a window blink. The sky was tea-colored today. My breath matched the brook. And so, the notebook kept going. No longer Albert's. No longer one person's. Just Clumberwick's. Eventually, the world sped up. Cars got faster. Clocks got louder. But Clumberwick stayed slow. Maps sometimes left it off. GPS called it non-road destination. Visitors called it peaceful. Locals called it home. There were no skyscrapers, no digital signs, just wooden fences, leaning gates, and windows that still opened from the bottom. Some said Clumberwick was falling behind. But in truth, it was gently staying put, like a bridge that never moved, only let others pass. ... The brook never stopped. Even when the bridge fell, even when the villagers slept, the brook carried on. It whispered to roots. It spoke in ripples. It remembered, and once a year, when the moon hung low and the wind calmed, it reflected something more than trees and stars. It reflected stories, moments, a vicar blessing planks, a girl with a bonnet, a boy who watched stars, and a man with a teacup on his head. All flowing, never rushed, just as the brook had always done. Just as the village had learned to do. There is No monument to the bridge, no statue, no display. But there is a feeling when you walk through Clumberwick and the breeze brushes your sleeve and the light lands just right through a window. You feel it. The bridge that helped a cat cross, that carried a barrel of apples, that heard footsteps and whispers and weather. It isn't forgotten because it was never loud enough to require remembering. It was simple. It was steady. It was enough. And in a world that spins faster each day, that kind of quiet is worth honoring. So, if you find yourself by a window or a brook or a bench with no name, pause and listen. You might not hear anything, but if you feel the hush inside you, that's the bridge. Still holding, still connecting, still there. The end.